All right. So, for the 15th time this evening, welcome. Andy and I are so glad to see you. Regina, who is the co executive director of Powell House, one of our hosts, cannot be here this evening. And so she asked me to say a few words about who Powell House is in the world. Powell House is the retreat center for New York yearly meeting. It is a gorgeous, gorgeous place to go on retreat as a community or as an individual person. I often visit there to do some writing, actually, and visit with friends. um, Powell House has really transcended its role as a retreat center, however, and has become, one of the, I always say Regina is one of my primary enablers. And in her role as executive director, she has done a phenomenal job of creating space for experimental ministries, including this ministry on ministry itself, and has done a lot of resourcing and permission giving for the work I've done in the last couple of years on the topic of public ministry. So I'm very grateful to Regina and Powell House. Um, Andy, would you like to give a welcome from your institution?
Sure. Well, it's great to be with you all. My name's Andy Stanton-Henry. I live in East Tennessee, and I'm the co-director of the Quaker Leadership Center. And the other co-director is here, but I'm not sure if she's able to pop up and say hi. There she goes. We got a wave. Della Stanley Green. So we are sometimes known as Team Hyphen. With our last names. And Katrina McConaughey is our administrative assistant, and she's here waving as well. So I'm glad they could join us. We are a ministry of ESR, Earlham School of Religion, and we started just a couple of years ago originally from a Lilly Endowment grant, and we support Quaker leaders of all kinds from all the different streams, and are aiming to help Quaker congregations faithfully adapt to times that are changing. And so this is a great partnership. We try to really have a philosophy of non-competition with other Quaker organizations. So I'm glad we could work with Wendy and with Powell House on this. If you're interested in learning more about the Quaker Leadership Center and what we're doing, I'll put a link in the chat where you can subscribe to our communications.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Quaker Leadership Center, and really appreciate the collaborations that Della and Andy and I have had thus far. So I commend them to you, other public ministers. Um, why are we here? How did this come to be? Um, so I've been what we call or don't call a public minister in the Quaker tradition for over a decade now. Um, I began my ministry with a concern around interpersonal violence in my monthly meeting and then my yearly meeting. And then it turns out that I was concerned about interpersonal violence in the Religious Society of Friends as a whole. That took me to ESR, where I met Andy. We were classmates together, and Andy's wife, Ashlyn. Seminary is a wonderful place to make lifelong friends. I see other fellow seminarians here this evening. And I went to seminary thinking that they were going to give me all the answers. I was going to leave ESR with a plan for how to address um, interpersonal violence in my yearly meeting specifically, and I didn't get all the answers at ESR. It turns out the seminary doesn't do that. But what I did get was a profoundly non shaming, highly experimental environment in which to explore my ministry through my relationships with my peers and with my elders in seminary, and a much deeper appreciation for Quaker theology and culture. And that experience of being in seminary deepened the ministry call that I was engaged in and the labor that I was capable of. And today, you might know me as a trauma educator. And I also work with meetings that are in crisis to kind of discern how they got there and what they might like to do about it. Um, and I would say that my ministry is really about what Quakers call right relationship, which I think a lot of public ministers are engaged in. I'm really interested in the quality of our relationships. And that call to right relationship began to cause me to question very deeply my experience as a public minister. Um, so I am in the liberal tradition. Baltimore Yearly Meeting is dually affiliated, but most of our meetings are in the liberal tradition. Very much an FGC friend, um, and it was taboo. If I thought talking about domestic and sexual violence was taboo, in our traditions. Wow, trying to survive as a public minister. Um, so what is a public minister? I think that's, some of the labor that we're here to do this evening. But I often talk about how, while we are all ministers, some of us are called for some period of time into a full time labor with the people in our community or around our community. And that is public ministry. The Religious Society of Friends has a long and deep history. Our founders were public ministers. They were devoted full time to the health and well being and maturation of our community and the communities we touched. Um, and as a consequence of being engaged in such a full time way, I find that I have material and spiritual needs that have been very difficult to meet. And as I looked at my peers in public ministry in the liberal tradition and even in the pastoral tradition, I was surprised to find a lot of these concerns about how our communities are caring for us and laboring with us in our role as facilitator, even when we are popular, even when we are invited to speak, even when we have more work that has been given to us than we can keep up with. We find that we have material and spiritual needs that are very difficult to meet inside of our community because of some of the cultural taboos that we have peculiar to us. This led me to approach Powell House, my great permission giver, to work with Quaker institutions on a series of events that would help create awareness and create the conditions under which we could labor afresh on the topic of public ministry and how we recognize it, how we support it, how we discipline the practice, how we educate one another, and how we are ministers in each other's lives. Um, that's what I'm doing here. What are you doing here, Andy?
Great question, Wendy. Um, I don't know what you're talking about seminary. I personally did get all the answers I needed from seminary, but no, there's a friend that said he came to ESR with lots of questions, and then he left ESR with even more questions. And I think that's the experience of many people, but lots of good questions. And these questions around public ministry are really important. And I feel like Wendy's really taking the charge in exploring those and unpacking those, and continuing to ask those questions. I feel like Wendy has kind of, it's like Wendy's done a deep dive into it, and I'm kind of like on the shore watching the waves. So like I see the patterns, I see those things happening, but she's gone a lot deeper into these. But we do come from different traditions, whereas I come from actually grew up in evangelical Friends, and I'll get into that here in a second. And but probably feel more at home in kind of the FUM kind of camp right now. But it's definitely learned from a lot of different kinds of friends wherever there's life. Um, let's see. Yeah, I think so. There's a lot of differences, but there's also a lot of commonalities. There's plenty of pastor friends who would say, yeah, I get it. Like trying to deal with the financial parts of it, getting the spiritual nurture and support that you need, having healthy accountability. Like those are very real challenges among pastoral friends as well. So we're going to move into a time of maybe about 15 minutes ish each, um, talking a little bit more about our own journeys with public ministry. And as I was thinking about how to use this time, I considered several different things, like what is some tips and tricks, or like what are some principles of discernment for public ministers. But in the end, I landed on taking some time to tell my story with public ministry. And that's not because I have a special story. It's just because I think stories are powerful and can be helpful. And so actually, I've got some slides to share. I asked Wendy, I said, what are you thinking with this? Like, are you thinking we need like a slideshow or what? And she said, no, you don't need to worry about that. So I left our meeting and promptly made a PowerPoint presentation. And we were joking before we started that isn't this a great like illustration of pastoral and like programmed and unprogrammed here? Like, Wendy's trusting the spirit and I'm trusting the slides, and I don't know, somewhere I hope there's some helpful things for everyone here. So let's go ahead and share screen here. So why story? One is that story is a great way to let your life speak, right? As we say among friends, and that's both in the George Fox and Parker Palmer senses, right? That George Fox was like, let your life preach, like let it tell the story of what God is doing, how the light is at work. And then Parker Palmer wrote his wonderful little book, if you're familiar with that, where he kind of turns that and says, let your life speak, and it can tell you what to do with your life. Listen to your life. And story is a great way to do that. Secondly, biography. I've come to see biography as a kind of theology, that we experience the divine and we experience vocation in the midst of ordinary life. I like Thomas Merton, said to his fellow monks, if you want to have a spiritual life, you have to have a life. And often it's, just being aware and present to your ordinary life, and discernment happens in the midst of that. And we have this wonderful tradition of Quaker journals, right? That's always seeking to find the divine in the movements of our life. That phrase biography as theology comes from James McClendon, who was a Anabaptist theologian and ethicist, and I find that helpful. That ministry flows out of our identity and our story. And then thirdly, story leads to story. Sometimes what's most personal is the most universal in some mysterious way. And so I hope that as I share things from my story, which, as I said, is not special, it's just mine, that maybe it'll evoke a memory or evoke a pattern or something from your own life that will have you thinking about how you've discerned public ministry in your own story. So, as I said, I grew up in um, evangelical Friends. I went to a church called Gilead Friends Church, and that was in Mount Gilead, Ohio, which is a small town. And with small towns, you always have to say in relation to what city. So it's north of Columbus, Ohio. And it was a historic Quaker meeting that ended up growing quite a bit as I grew. I don't think that was in any way connected, but it just so happened to be the case that by the time I was in high school, there was actually about 700 people going to that church, and you can see kind of the development over time. And one thing I appreciate about growing up in this church was that they did give room to practice ministry. So whether that was like just being, being an usher, or help being a youth group leader, or having the chance to give a message. I had the chance to give bad sermons sometimes, it's the only way to learn. And so I'm grateful for that. What I wish was different was as they grew, they kind of de-emphasized the Quaker part of our identity, and kind of became more of a non-denominational church. And that was kind of part of this seeker sensitive thing happening at the time in the wider church. Actually, I have a friend who went to another church in that same yearly meeting, and they were at a youth event, and he had to go get something from the closet. And he pulled out this big picture, and he said, "Who is this old guy on this picture?" And somebody said, "Oh, that's George Fox." It was just like a great illustration of like literally hiding our tradition in the closet and hiding our light under a bushel. And so while I'm grateful for many things, that kind of generic evangelical faith didn't provide me what I needed to move into adulthood. And so as I was a teenager and questioning and searching different paths and different philosophies, it was actually me discovering Quakerism independently of my Quaker church that actually revitalized my faith. And that was, I think, what reading Thomas Kelly, reading Doug Steer and Rufus Jones, and this sense of Quaker spirituality and social action. And that was what in the evangelical language was my call to ministry. And it was really a call to Quaker ministry. So nevertheless, even with this call to ministry, it's like I still need to make a living, and I still want to make a difference. And how do you do that? And so when I started college, I majored in social work. So, just barely above the salary of what, excuse me, a Quaker public minister would make otherwise. And I really loved that work. And in some ways, I've never moved beyond that, those principles of social work, but I wanted to have spiritual conversations, like overtly spiritual conversations with people, and nurture that in a community. And so I ended up changing majors and actually transferring to Berkeley College, that was a holiness Quaker college in Western Kansas, and very interesting place in the Great Plains. And you can see some of the fellows I was hanging out with, a little different from maybe some friends from the East Coast. And John Starnes there was the guy with the cowboy hat from Oklahoma. But on the right, or on my right, is Dave Williams, and he was really a mentor in me understanding public ministry as pastoral ministry. And he modeled pastoral ministry after Jesus, which is, imagine that. But just this apprenticeship way of being a minister, which means It's not about learning ABC skills. It's about being in relationship with somebody. And often that ministry is caught more than taught. But also this model of intentionally developing leaders, which I think sometimes because we emphasize that kind of the spiritual part of it, we're like, we don't want to have anything that sounds programmatic at all. But this kind of apprenticeship approach of going from I do, you watch, and we talk, step by step until you get to you do, I watch, we talk. Which is just going back to what I said at the beginning of having room to practice things and to have somebody that can walk with you through that. So after I graduated from Berkeley, I started seminary in Oregon at what was used to be George Fox Seminary, is now Portland Seminary. And also while I was there, I started an internship and then became a member of the pastoral team at a meeting called North Valley Friends. It's in Newberg, Oregon. And it was really my first experience of a community, that spiritual community that was really seeking to be both Christ-centered and Quaker, and living that out in an authentic community. And there again, like, I can name the person that was mentoring me in that public ministry, and that her name was Lynn Holt, and she was the lead pastor there. And she was somebody who was very, I guess, secure in her calling and in her role. And so she was okay with like letting these young whippersnappers like try things out and experiment, and really, like, I think had this belief that to remain like a vital spiritual community, we have to be including younger voices and younger people. And that's also how you develop new public ministers. But what also developed in my time in Oregon was this idea of public ministry as social advocacy. And North Valley has their old meeting house burnt down, and they rebuilt, and they had a lot of land, and we're really discerning what to do with that land. And so one of the things they did was they made a walking path. They partnered with the Parks and Rec. They made a walking path around the property for the public that had peace poles along the way with quotes about peace. And there's a big labyrinth. And that was some of the work that I got to do when I was on staff, was overseeing this, what was called the Peace Project, and hosting. We did these night labyrinth walks that were really cool, and events there, and starting to do these International Day of Peace events with the community. So it's like kind of expanding the circle beyond the meeting. And so we worked with, like some other local churches and the Rotary Club, and there's a Baha'i religious community there, and learning to see that public ministry as of kind of the advocacy piece. And then I have in time expanded it even more and started doing stuff with FCNL, and like maybe God's at work even in Washington, D.C., and meeting with Congress people. And so that was another expression of public ministry for me. And then I went through a kind of personal crisis in my life, and I don't need to get into all the details, but it brought me to a point where all the things I had planned for the future were not clear anymore, and back to that discernment drawing board. And so after kind of regaining some just personal stability, I two things emerged in my discernment. One was I wanted to transfer to ESR, finish my seminary at ESR. And two was that I wanted to move back to the Midwest where I was from. And so I did. And I thought maybe, well, I'm a fancy seminarian, and my home church that I showed you earlier was without a pastor. And I knew that, long term it wasn't a very good fit, but I thought, well, maybe temporarily I could, step in and help and share all the answers that I found from seminary. But unfortunately, they weren't interested. That was a no-go, and I actually kind of got interrogated about my beliefs and why I would go to that school, ESR, Earlham School of Religion. And so um, where I did get a job was at a public library. And I've actually come to see that as being like one of my most meaningful public ministry experiences. And I know that we can quibble about like what's the definition and what fits and what doesn't. But what I ended up being able to do was, well, for one, I didn't tell people I was in seminary because one, it's a public library and that wasn't really the place to share my faith. And two, I didn't want to scare people away. Like I wanted them to be themselves, and they were. And when you're behind a desk, you're basically you're trapped. The people know you're a captive audience, and they can talk and talk and tell you all kinds of stuff they wouldn't tell a pastor. And so I was able to develop meaningful relationships, really with hear what's real in the community, and offer care and offer practical help, and read books to kids, which was a lot of fun too. Um, but one person did find out that I was in seminary though, and this guy was you know several generation Italian Catholic, and he didn't have a place for Quakers, so he called me father. He'd come in and say, "Father, this happened this week, and that happened this week." So it's very real public ministry in my book. And on the right was a vigil that we held in our small town, and that's a whole nother story. But it was just being a presence in the community, outside of the meeting house, outside of a local church. And so when I moved back to Ohio, I thought I was going to live there the rest of my life. I had this kind of Wendell Berry dream of like stay in one place and be deeply rooted and change your region and be buried with your ancestors. But the only thing with that is that I met somebody in seminary named Ashlyn, and we got married, and she had those same convictions about her own family and her own place in East Tennessee. So, I guess with the whole equality testimony, you've got to be willing to go wherever that leads for both ministers, both partners. So we ended up moving to Tennessee. And while we were here, I got the job that I have now that's led me to you all with the Quaker Leadership Center. And I put on their institutional stewardship, which isn't exactly what that's the best phrase I could come up with, but just it kind of goes back to that original calling of there's something special about this Quaker message and movement that's worth stewarding to another generation. And circling all the way back, though, is that we also, both Ashlyn and I it's a long story, funny story, that we ended up becoming co-pastors at this small Quaker meeting down the road. And we love it. And it's quirky and sometimes frustrating and beautiful at the same time. And these are probably my two favorite pictures of our ministry so far. And on my left, we have the older gentleman. His name is Pete. And when we first started there, Pete was the only person that attended. Every Sunday, he'd show up, ring the bell, maybe sing some hymns and pray himself for a long time. And so he's had a blast of seeing more and more people come. But I just love this picture because Ashlyn's reading a story kind of as a children's time. And I look back and he just has this huge grin on his face. And I had to take a picture, and like, this is just a wonderful like intergenerational moment here. On the other side is a girl named Avery. And I got her family's permission to share this, but she kept coming up to us afterwards, after worship, and saying, um, I want to be the preacher. And she would kind of go behind the pulpit and like feel what it was like to be back there. And um, eventually Ashton was like, okay, let's do that. And next week's on integrity. Do you want to give a message about integrity? And so she did. She prepared this message, and she had to have a stepping stool to get up to the pulpit. And it was really funny because about halfway through she took another step and was even taller. Like she gained the confidence or something. But she did this great message and had uh, bananas and oranges, and it was about being the same inside and out. And she used sticky notes, which was so sweet because we had been doing that with the congregation, of like bringing out the dreams and visions of the leadings of the community. So she wanted to do that too. And it was just so special because I mean, she's kind of sassy, so she had a little bit more confidence than most people to put herself out there. But she had learned that um, we were the kind of place where different people could be upfront, that we're a community of ministers, and that can be all different ages and personalities. And secondly, that she had seen Ashlyn behind the pulpit. And so she didn't even have to question, can girls and women do that? Can they be there? So again, that's more of a for a pastoral tradition of Friends, but I think we can all find the application in that, letting opening your mouth, let your life speak, but also let your mouth speak to say, sure, you can do this. Would you like to try this imperfectly, awkwardly? But that's the only way you learn. And we'll make space for that. We'll encourage that. We can talk about it afterwards. Like I think that's how we discern public ministry, not only internally, but also in the voices of friends who accompany us. So just three, not really takeaways, but maybe matters for your own reflection. And we'll get to this. We'll have an invitation for journaling at the end here. But I just love this Merton quote that talks about it's about journaling, but he says keeping a journal has taught him that there's not so much new in your life as you might sometimes think. That when you reread your journal, you find out that your latest discovery is something you already found out 5 years ago. Still, it is true that one penetrates deeper and deeper into the same ideas and the same experience. And so I think that's part of the power of stories, looking back and being like, oh yeah, I did see this before. I did learn how to discern this before. Sometimes when I'm discerning, I hear what I interpret as a divine voice saying, we've already talked about this. It's like we've already talked about what your calling is for this season of life, or how you inhabit your life in the world. And that can be refreshing too, to take a breath. Public ministry is like a labyrinth. As I look back at these different expressions of public ministry, it's not a linear thing like, oh, I learned this, I learned that, and then I learned now, and now I've arrived. But it's that circling around the center. And sometimes things feel more aligned. Some things look like this, sometimes they look like that. But in each season and each stage, we're being faithful. And that's the third thing, is public ministry is seasonal. So it's okay to be a public librarian one season and be a pastoral minister another season. And those are all valid. And those are all important. And this was while working at the library, we did a Halloween thing, and I couldn't think of anything scarier than unprecedented times. So that was my outfit of coping with COVID at that time. But just that God is creative and calling is dynamic. I come back to that a lot. And another workshop for another time is open and relational theology that just helps us break away from that kind of God predetermining everything and everything fitting in A, B, C, D in this divine plan, and more of being present, of being in our relationships and being in our season fully. Okay. Well, thank you for taking that journey with me, and hopefully something evoked for you, something meaningful in your discernment. So Wendy mentioned that we both went to ESR and knew each other there. Well, the first memory I have of Wendy is in China. And we went on this, what's it called, contextual theology trip to China. And a lot of folks there were not used to seeing kind of the bigger guys with beards and everything. So a lot of people like to take pictures, even the police. So I like this picture memory from China. But one of the things, so a couple years ago, I wrote an article for Friends Journal, and I told about this person who everywhere we went, we've got a language barrier, right? So you have to kind of keep things simple, and it's really hard to keep things simple when you're trying to describe Quakerism, right? I'd like to say that the elevator speech for Quakerism requires either a really tall building or a really slow elevator. So even more so when you got a language barrier. So who are Quakers? Well, this person kept on saying, the way I heard it, we'll say, was Quakers don't have pastors. And it just, every time I heard that, it got under my skin of like, I've been a Quaker pastor. I know wonderful Quaker pastors. That's not really the whole story. And so I included this in this article. And when Wendy emails me and says, were you talking about me? And what can you say? She said, I'm sorry I made you feel that way, and here's what I was trying to say. And so Wendy wanted me to tell that story as a way of showing there are tensions between there's a lot of commonalities, but there's also this tensions between the programmed and unprogrammed, pastoral and liberal. And it's good to talk about those in these kinds of conversations. So I'll turn things over to you now, Wendy.
Thank you, Andy. See, it wasn't that hard to air our dirty laundry, was it? I,
Not
I
too
heard
bad.
I heard you get a little nervous there when I when I invited Andy to tell that story. He was like, "It's just like you to walk straight into the tension." So, um, I um I want to say, Andy, I so appreciate your story. Um, you're right that you tell your story in a way that I wouldn't choose to. There are really, there are cultural differences between pastoral and liberal friends. Um, but in your story, I heard the lesson of apprenticeship really loudly, and this idea that the role of elders is to serve as mentors for others, not to teach them, you know, how to do things, ABC, but to create spaces for discernment and growth and change. There's a joke I like to tell, which is how many Quakers does it take to change a light bulb? Change? Um, and so often in the liberal tradition, which I feel qualified to speak to, um, this is the reputation that our elders have. Um, they are the people that stand in the way. There's a lot of frustration. This is not news to anyone who is here, I'm sure. There has been some really destructive conflict inside the Religious Society of Friends for a number of years. That map of schisms, for instance, just keeps getting bigger and bigger by the year. Um, and it's it makes me profoundly sad, that we have been so unable to understand each other and act on the love that we have for each other. Um, so I'm so glad, Andy, that you are a good elder to those that you care for and that you have found good elders. Um, in the sharing of my story, I see your hand, Karen. Um, do you need to ask a question now, or can you wait?
I can wait, but I wanted it's related to what you said about schisms, and I wanted to acknowledge you because it was hard to be here for me due to hearing more about a meeting in Northwest Yearly Meeting.
Mm,
Uh, so thank you.
thank you, Karen. Yeah, these the unhealthy kind of conflict that we have had has damaged all of our hearts. Um, I want to tell you some about my own spiritual journey, my own discernment around public ministry, which is a very different story, I think, in some important ways than Andy's story. Um, so I grew up Pentecostal. So I am, no stranger to charismatic religion. And I left the Assemblies of God when I was a teenager and really wanted nothing more to do with church. But I had been a deeply religious child. Actually, it was, I think, my taking my religiosity, my relationship with God so seriously that drove me away from the church. And I think that's true of a lot of people. And I think many of us land with liberal friends. Liberal friends is full of people who are refugees from other denominations, and I carry the sort of religious trauma of my childhood around with me. How can I not? And other people are carrying theirs. um when I found friends, I was invited to a Christmas party one year with my then 7-year-old child. I had been a teenage mom, so I was a young adult at this time, and I really I craved religious community again, but didn't have the words for it, and I found my needs met there. Um, as a result of domestic violence in the marriage I was in, I then needed to leave that meeting, which is a whole other story. Um, and that was my first calling into public ministry. I had been a labor organizer and a community organizer. So, in some ways, I was ministering my whole life. Like Andy was talking about being a librarian. Social justice organizing is very similar to ministry we might do among Quakers. Actually, the skills I developed as an organizer have been immensely helpful as a minister. I think, the series of events about public ministries is an example of using organizing skills, developing relationships and communication between institutions. So I see in my life how, if I were to have a slide for this, it would say, the skills and experiences you have from before you called yourself a minister are going to be absolutely useful to your life as a minister. And I would encourage you to identify what you're bringing with you. Um, but then as several years later, skip ahead, I met a woman named Joan Liversidge at my annual session, who has been a very good elder to me. And I was describing to her before I went to seminary um, how how troubled I was about the presence of interpersonal violence in our yearly meeting. And I had begun to speak to others about that in the context of our yearly meeting. And Joan said, "You are a public minister." And I had an allergic reaction to that assertion um, because of my religious trauma and because I thought that I had landed in a place where, you know, authoritarian authoritarianism is what I associated with ministry. But this wouldn't happen. I didn't actually believe that we were all ministers. Though that is an explicit part of our theology. I sort of believed us to be without ministers because we were without pastors in the liberal tradition. And I saw all this danger in, naming someone a minister. Um, and Joan was like, "Oh, no, no, tut, tut, tut. Like, we have a rich tradition of public ministry." Um, and Joan really championed my ministry call with other friends, and indeed continues to really labor with others with me and on my behalf. um, it is often news to people who have had some experience with me in recent years um, that my relationship with my monthly meeting, which has embraced my ministry. I have a minute of embrace from my liberal meeting from 2019. And before that, in 2018, the yearly meeting embraced the ministry. I've had several travel minutes, which is, something we can talk about later in the series when we talk about eldering. They're essentially an introduction to other friends in the form of a letter. I've had several over the years. The most recent one I received on my birthday last month. And when I opened my mail and read what the meeting had said about me, I just wept with gratitude. It was such a brave and affirming statement. And so people assume because I am where I am that the meeting is just an especially competent meeting and, always knew how to embrace and support a ministry. Um, Nothing could be further from the truth. I am so often in trouble. I saw some people from the meeting signed up for this. So here I am going straight into the conflict, straight into the tension again. But this is true. And we know it's true. I'm often in trouble. People write letters about me to ministry and council complaining about what I've said or done most recently. There is tension and conflict around the public ministry, and there's also celebration and mentorship and maturity around it. And I would say that I did not I did not come to this meeting fully formed like Venus, coming out of the ocean in my shell, ready to go. I did not come as a mature minister, and the meeting did not receive me as a mature meeting that was, fully capable of supporting ministry. But what we have is a relationship where we love each other, we fight, and we love each other. and we don't know what we're doing, and we love each other, and we're scared and anxious, and we love each other, and we find ways of talking about it. Um, and I think this is really important because I have an ongoing temptation, and I know many of us have a temptation to leave our local worshiping community when we feel that we have a call. I've done research on this. So I'm a demon now, which means a doctor of ministry candidate, which is hilarious. So I'm a demon. And as part of my demon work, I have done qualitative research on the experience of public ministers, mainly in the liberal tradition. And we're just hanging on by a thread to our local worshiping communities so often. And instead of developing our relationships there, what we're doing is we're finding each other. Like, we're all friends. You know, we hang out online. We have our own worshiping communities sometimes. And this is wonderful that we have each other for peer support. But exactly the thing that we don't want to happen is sort of happening, in that we're sort of being set apart, not because we're important. We're very much not important. We don't get paid anything in the liberal tradition. The only reason I can do what I do is because my husband supports me. And so, that's another conversation we're having at my meeting right now. And it's painful, it's hard, it's embarrassing and vulnerable. And it's the reason, it's like a call for all of us to grow together again. Um, but that's where the work is. Like, that's the sweet spot. Like, that's what we're doing, is we're transforming our communities, we're transforming our relationships. So I don't have um I often pick on Cosmo magazine, but Good Housekeeping too. When you're at the grocery store, you there's magazines, and they'll always say, top 5 tips to have like the most amazing vacation, the top 10 towns you can live in, 3 easy steps to perfect pasta. And, like, they're always disappointing. You can't even cook pasta according to, like, the top 3 steps from Cosmo or whatever. It's garbage. And so I don't wanna give you numbered or lettered garbage, because the truth is that you have to find a way of laboring with your meeting that doesn't have any idea what it's doing, is perhaps hostile to the idea of public ministry, but they love you and you love them, and that's why you're there. And your relationships with other people who have been there, like me and Andy and other people in this room and other peers and colleagues you have, can support you through the hard process of maturing with your meeting into a place where you can discern your ministry call and discern what kind of support they can give for that ministry. And also what you might be called to do as an elder now or in the future to support other people's discernment of public ministry. So, Andy and I wanted to give you a chance to talk to each other and tell some of your own ministry stories, or what concerns brought you here today. Maybe you're here not because you feel called to a particular ministry. Maybe you're here because you want to support someone in your meeting. Maybe you're here because you want to help create processes for reaching out to potential public ministers. Maybe you're here because you've never heard of public ministry before. Maybe you're here because you're hostile to the idea. Maybe you're here because you are called. Maybe you're in the middle of a call and you want to find some way of talking to your meeting about what this experience is for you and what kind of work you can do together. So we're going to put you into breakout groups of 3, um, which I think I'm doing. Is that right, Andy? Do you want to talk while I do executive function things?
Sure. Did you hear about the joke about how many Quakers it takes to change a light bulb? Oh, wait, we've already heard that one. This will be great. I'm looking forward to hearing after your breakout group conversations. We'll put some themes that come up in the chat, and I'm looking forward to hearing where each of you are coming from or your groups are coming from, because we're all at different places. Some of us are interested in developing public ministers or public ministries, and others of us are trying to make our own way where there seems to be no way. So be able to get those groups, Wendy.
Yep, I am. I was waiting for you to be done talking, Andy.
Oh, okay. I'm
So
done.
so I'm opening the rooms now. There will be 3 to 4 people in each group. If you can just and you'll be there for 15 minutes. If you can divide your time up appropriately, we will call you back at a little after 8:15.